eventually we're gonna run out of land. I don't know if you're aware, but right now it's not only that fresh water is limiting, is that the fuel that we have is getting saline because of water intrusion. So we need to start moving to the ocean. The thing is, how do we do it wisely? How do we learn about the many mistakes that we have done and do it in a fairly sustainable way?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McDonough, and you're joining me today for the third episode of the Moot podcast. Today with me, I have Dr. Schery Umanzor, Assistant Professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. Say hi to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Ian.
Hi. So Schery and I actually met at the University of Connecticut Stanford's Yarish Marine Biotechnologies Lab, where we're working on a project, Project Mariner, where the goal is essentially to breed kelp, sugar kelp, for use as biofuel. Recently, Schery has moved up to University of Alaska Fairbanks and is speaking with us today from Juneau, Alaska, which is, wow.
Cold and humid, but beautiful.
Sounds gorgeous. I have heard great things about Juneau, though, so maybe a little bit more, less of a shift than Nome. Actually, no, where is Nome? Nome is in the Panhandle, right?
No, it's up north.
My Alaskan geography is way subpar. I'm sorry. But as long as things are good up there, fantastic. So I've been convinced for a long time that solving the clean energy problem is maybe one of the big factors in bringing about a better and more sustainable world. This is sort of what drew me to the Yarish Marine Biotechnology Lab in the first place. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field, and what you're doing now at the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Sure. So let's start from the beginning.
Please.
I got into seaweed aquaculture about 10 years ago, working in the tropics in Costa Rica. And our idea was to set up seaweed and shrimp systems for impoverished communities to allow them to have an income option whenever the moratorium was in place. So this particular region has a moratorium for fishing, like it's for about 6 months. That means that if you depend on fishing, there is 6 months where your income is very limited. So we brought this idea: can we grow seaweeds and can we grow shrimps, and have an opportunity there for communities? And one thing got me to another. I got more interested into this idea: how can we optimize the production of seaweed? How can we translate what we know, like science-based, to the community? With that, at the time I was a master's when I was working in that particular project, and decided to do a PhD, kind of really to get the social license or credibility that I was able to do things, mainly because of funding. So I decided to go to Mexico rather than any other place in the world, because Mexico has a seaweed tradition to some extent, and it has some background on aquaculture also. And the social situation was similar to that in Central America where I was based. So I felt it was easy to translate what I learned there and just go back home in Costa Rica. It didn't happen that way, because I was hired by the University of Connecticut to engage in the breeding program that you mentioned. And from that, I became almost obsessed with the fact that we can optimize processes and that we can bring this to a larger audience. And that this can really help eventually on, having cleaner energies and also optimize production at sea, and maybe supplement fisheries with aquaculture. So that brought me to Alaska.
I think one of the things that, so when I've mentioned to a few people, both when I was in the lab and now, that I was working in this field, and I got a lot of sort of perplexed looks. And I think one of the things that maybe the public doesn't quite understand is why this, I hesitate to reduce nature to a technology, but in a sense it is, or the Kelp program is, why this is interesting. And I think that what people may not get is how multi-dimensional the applications of this are. Everything from cleaning the water to providing jobs, to providing food, to energy, to nutrient remediation. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the many applications that developing these sort of fisheries and aquaculture farms can have?
Sure. Perhaps an easy way to start is to think of farm field on land. How many opportunities can derive from, I'm just going to call it, from a cornfield. Mm. So it's food, it's shelter for animals. Now it's transitioning into energy. So they are converting corn to ethanol, and then ethanol to a biofuel. So and if you think in terms of, environmental benefits to some extent, you have carbon sequestration there. So through photosynthesis, plants fix carbon, produce oxygen, and while they are doing this, they are also producing biomass, and that is what we eat. When the plant decays, then it goes back to the soil, so it's kind of it's a loop, right? Nutrient loop. So this can be translated to the ocean. It's something similar. Perhaps the greatest difference relies on the fact that you need to fertilize a cornfield. So you are adding things. And for seaweed aquaculture, it's actually extractive. You don't need to fertilize, but actually kelp in this case uptakes the nutrients that are in the water, and it uses that to grow. So it provides an additional service that is not necessarily found on land, and that is cleaning water. And we call this bioextraction.
Right. Most of the University of Connecticut's program is actually located in Long Island Sound, which is notoriously, there's quite a lot of runoff from the farms up the Connecticut River and up the East River, which become deposited. So I think really it is in many ways like conventional land agriculture. However, it is not, whereas land agriculture, as you say, requires inputs, this not only cleans the water, it also produces crops without competing with land crops for actual space.
Correct. Two things. It doesn't compete for space, and it doesn't compete for fresh water. Right. Because it doesn't require fresh water.
Yeah.
That's correct. And, associated with this, there are many other things. It's been said that it supports fisheries because the three-dimensional structure of kelp itself is like a forest. So it becomes a nursery and feeding ground for fish with economic interest as well. And if you think a little bit more adventurous, then it can be it can be good for tourism, as it happens for other countries, because people like to dive inside these man-made created forests, and other people just tour just to see how a farm looks like.
So one of the projects that the lab had was something called three-dimensional aquaculture. So it's these multiple layers of, on the top layer where photosynthesis happens, we have the kelp, then we have these strands of shellfish going all the way to the bottom, and it's really about using as much of the square footage as possible, or the cubed footage, I guess would be the case. It suddenly got very dark in here. I hope that's not too much of a problem. So when we're talking about developing fisheries, is this 3D aquaculture strategy something which is being used in other locations? Is this something that's really taking off, or is this more of a local plan?
I think the whole concept of 3D aquaculture, or in a more formal terminology, is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, because you are integrated the cultivation of species that come from multiple trophic levels.
Right.
So IMTA. So it's not a novel concept. It's been there for decades in other countries. China, Chile has a lot of trajectory already on that. It's perhaps something that it's becoming new in the United States, because the whole aquaculture industry, it's something that it's developing, especially when we think in species that are not fish. So shellfish, seaweeds, cucumbers. These are, new options that are coming into research in the market as a whole.
Really? What's the traditional use for sea cucumbers?
Food. I mean, it's very, very expensive in Asia, and it's a huge fishery. So collecting them from the wild is a huge fishery in Alaska. As with any other species, the problem is that the resource decreases over time. So it's just better to grow it or farm it. Yeah, but it has a huge market value.
So what do you feel comfortable speaking about? Like, if you had to sum up the Mariner project to someone who maybe hasn't heard of it before.
Okay, good question. So the Mariner program falls within, the Department of Energy. So this program, it's huge, multi-millionaire program that is not only fixed to like growing seaweeds per se. Right. It's a whole idea, and it revolves around helping or leading the United States to become a worldwide leader in biomass production of seaweeds. It's not only kelp, although kelp is, I think, the biggest component. There are also tropical seaweeds, because remember, Puerto Rico and Hawaii, they bring all the tropical components. So this program is divided in the farm design. How do you create farms that can be easily to scale up? Now, you also want, because we are thinking on, or maybe I should step back a little bit. So the idea is to be able to produce or install farms offshore. So this will not be something that you can see from your backyard. We are talking about kilometers or miles from the coast into the ocean. So with that said, you don't have the protection of a coastline. You have open water. Just imagine where they install the oil platforms. It's pure open water. So we are imagining the same thing for farms. So the whole Mariner program encompasses all the engineering that has to go around building farms in open water. Then all of the monitoring. So there is a lot of interest in building ROVs that can do the surveying and, to reduce people presence in the farm, and hence reduce risks because of storms and anything related to that. And then it has, how do you optimize hatcheries? Because it's not the same thing producing seed for a 1 hectare farm than from thousands of hectares. So in brief, is building all these pathways that will allow the US to become a leader in biomass production. And this includes engineering, monitoring, producing, harvesting, and processing.
I remember hearing one of the hurdles which needed to be overcome was essentially that when you have these sort of far offshore farms, you need the kelp relatively close to the surface to take full advantage of the light for photosynthesis, but you also need to bring up much deeper water for the nutrients. Do you know if anyone is working on that right now? Maybe even someone who's listening to this might be the one who solves it.
Yes, there are one or two teams that are working on this. That's a broad topic, so I'm just gonna try to narrow it. So nutrient limitation it doesn't happen everywhere. So cool waters are usually rich in nutrients, while tropical waters tend to be poor. So the immediate problem here, or the immediate challenge, is going to be how do you want to seed farms in tropical waters where nutrients are limiting? Right now, we don't know how, we really don't understand well how nutrients will be limited by the scale of the farms. That is something that it's ongoing, and there is a lot of numerical modeling going on it, real measurements as well. So there are a couple of teams that are working on techniques on how to pump water from 500 meters depth up to the surface. There's other teams that are working on elevators, so trying to bring the whole farm to several meters in depth at certain time of day, and then bringing it up when there is more sunlight. So there are ideas out there. There's still a lot of ground to cover.
So I've read some various estimates about this, but what sort of scale would you hope this this sort of aquaculture could reach in the United States? Is this something we could see in every state, or is this something that's more regionally limited? Clearly, we're not talking about Nebraska as much, but close.
You know, again, there is a lot of ground to cover when moving from the near shore to the offshore. And the idea of moving to the offshore is that there's going to be less hurdle as far as permitting, because you will really not be interfering with other activities, especially recreational boating, right. Which is multimillionaire, especially in places like Long Island Sound. You know, there's a lot of people that do not want to see buoys from their window.
Yeah.
So I think that is really going to depend on whether these farms are really installed offshore, or is something that is going to be limited to the more near shore. And it's also going, it's also going to depend on the states. Every state has different policies.
But policy aside, is this something we could see in, like, let's say, we mentioned tropical, and we've also mentioned some very cold water climates that this is a viable option in. But is this, like, one of the things that struck me was the enormous variety of different seaweeds and how they could be theoretically used in almost any sort of climate. Is this accurate? Is this something we could really see up and down the coast of the United States, or is this more of a regional?
I think that is the dream, right? To see it all over the United States. And you very well mentioned there are so many different types of seaweeds that I mean, if this was just something theoretical, we could have farms from the northernmost to the southernmost part of the United States, including islands. So it's something that can happen. The other thing that needs to happen is that we need to learn how to domesticate these species, because this is only starting. We are in baby steps learning how to domesticate, and perhaps kelp is one of the most domesticated and still not 100%.
Right. So I want to go back again to some of the different applications that you can, some of the different applications of the sugar kelp we were working with. So, and additionally other different types of seaweed. we talked a little bit about how they can be used for nutrient reclamation and energy, but we're also, I've seen some different plans to use it as a fertilizer, as compost, as animal feed, and I think I've seen some. We had you had a colleague, I had a supervisor, yes, technically, who recently went off to work at a startup who was breeding. The startup was breeding kelp, essentially to feed to cattle to reduce their methane emissions. I was hoping you could speak to some of the broad uses of kelp and other seaweeds, both industrial, commercial, broadly.
Sure. So the colleague is actually not growing kelp. It's another type of seaweed. It's a red seaweed.
Right.
But yeah, it's supposed to reduce methane emissions from cattle. But going back to your questions, so something important to mention is that the use of seaweed is fairly novel for the Western countries. It's been a tradition for hundreds of years in Asia. So we are only coming to discover what, to some extent, they already know. So yeah, in general terms, not only kelp, but they are used as fertilizers, and they're also very important thickeners for the food industry. So if you flip and you go to the ingredients in many of daily use products, say butter, milk, many meats, things in a can, they say either carrageenan or alginates. Mm-hmm. So they are, I don't know, I'm just going to throw a number, a very low number. They are in 5 of every 10 products.
Wow. I think one of the most surprising ones is actually ice cream. I've seen more than a few. Yeah.
Yeah, ice cream. Exactly. It's because it's a gel. It's a thickener. So what they do is that they heat the biomass, or they cool the biomass, and they extract the gel. And it's fairly cheap.
Yes.
Fairly cheap. And imagine that is so important in the food industry, that it is a limiting factor.
So we spoke a little bit about, or we spoke a little bit before I started recording about how the primary focus of your research right now is primarily on kelp and aquaculture, seaweed and aquaculture as a food source. Could you speak a little bit more about that, particularly in the context of growing populations and climate change and the need for more food, essentially?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, right now I'm once again invested in trying to. So we already cover a lot of ground, and when I say we, I'm talking about science, not me particularly. Cover some ground as far as domesticating kelps, and try to understand how do we grow kelp in the lab and then send it to farms to deploy them at farms at sea. And before we can get to biofuels, which is maybe how seaweeds are being publicized more lately, there are a lot of baby steps that we need to follow. And perhaps this has to do with scale. To be able to convert seaweed biomass from biomass to a compound that can energize a system, you need to have a lot of hectares or a lot of dry matter. So before we get to that, we need to start with small kelp farms, and we need to use that biomass for something. Kelps and seaweeds, not only kelps, they are very rich in proteins. Of course, it varies from seaweed to seaweed. They are so diverse that it's even hard to, just summarize. But they're also rich in minerals as well, zinc, which might be limiting. Some of them have iron. So since there is a global need for high quality protein, which we usually get from meat, seaweed becomes a good option, a good and let's call it cheap option. Because, contrary to cattle, or any animal really, you don't need to feed seaweeds. They harvest sunlight, capture CO2, and then produce biomass. So we are going from there. Of course, we are not in a society that is used to eat raw seaweed. In fact, a lot of people do not like even the idea of eating seaweed. So we need to start thinking, how do we process this to incorporate it in our daily diet? And, you're slowly trying to see options like kelp chips. And
I'm reminded of a notorious episode at the when I was at the lab, when we essentially we had I don't know what would you even call it, like an expo, like we were trying to produce we were working with Norwalk Community College's culinary department, and we were in charge of preparing a series of meals around kelp. And I believe there's like a stock, like a soup we try to produce. I think the favorite was the kelpsidias, which was
kelpsidia. Yes.
it was yeah.
Yeah, I think that the first talking merely about food, one of the first thing is trying to bring down this barrier that kelp is fishy or tastes fishy.
No.
Because there are great chefs out there that can really mask the flavor but keep the quality. Right. So you will still have a lot of protein. Mm-hmm. And with all these vegan diets and all of these variations of vegetarian, flexitarian, vegan, kelp is just a natural option to explore. And it's fairly easy to digest. You don't need to eat a lot to have the same outcomes, I guess, quality-wise. So it's a good option. It's just started moving forward. But again, this is an industry that is just starting, from farmer to direct consumer. So lots of opportunities there.
I think we're going to need our version of Anthony Bourdain to sort of take kelp and make it a hot commodity. I remember someone was trying to pitch kelp as the new kale. I don't think that quite caught on, but I'd love to see it. I think there's actually a startup company that was trying to produce a meal replacement, essentially using a large part of algae, but I don't believe that I don't think their quality controls were quite up to snuff. Maybe someone else will jump on this, but it's one of these sort of food sources which is so. I think it's probably one of the greenest sources of calories you can imagine, considering it doesn't require fresh water, herbicides, pesticides, or really anything. And in fact cleans its environment just by its own life cycle.
Yeah, and there is this company in Maine mm-hmm. that is actually they actually have products, and I try a sushi for kimchi, but this is made of it's called sushi, so it's like a kimchi made of kelp. They also have a kelp salad, which is pretty good. There are companies that have pasta, like kind of mac and cheese, but it has a lot of kelp on it, right. And relish, kelp salsas. Yeah, there are options. There are options both in the West and East Coast. So entrepreneurs are out there. It's only a matter of time when we really start seeing a lot of products. Perhaps right now, the products are somewhat expensive if you compare it, but it's just a matter of optimizing processes, of building a bigger market, and then prices will drop, options will increase.
So you heard that here, folks. Help save the earth, buy kelp kimchi. Sushi is it pronounced? Sushi?
Yeah, it's called sushi. Yeah,
Save
and
the
it's
world, sushi.
I mean, if I can publicize these people, it's Atlantic Sea Farms. They are based in Maine.
Please
But
do.
there are others, Barnacle Seafoods, Blue Evolution. So there are small companies there. And you know, one of the things that I like the most is that these are really small companies. Is you don't have a huge super company that is pretty much dominating the whole market. So that's also nice. But aside from food, you know, there is also, I mean, there is a lot of topics to talk about. This whole movement of moving to bioplastics.
Yes.
And remember the gel that I told you? The same gel is useful to create bioplastics, the alginates. So again, in these ones, you have big companies putting their cents in.
It's really one of the unsung workhorses of like the food industry. And also, I believe makeup, it's a big component.
Makeup,
Yes.
correct?
One of the
Correct.
unsung workhorses. So clearly the problem is for using kelp as a biofuel, or really any seaweed as a biofuel, is a matter of scale. We've talked a little bit about how these sort of smaller boutique applications can grow the market and eventually get to a point where it's produced with such at such scale that it can be used for a biofuel. But could you speak to a little bit to some of the various ways that it could actually be converted into fuel?
I will not be the the right person to ask. I just know that right now, so the hydrolysis process is not very efficient. So as it stands right now, it's more expensive to produce it than the savings that you could have from using it.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there anyone using it either for is there anyone using it to produce methane, or potentially fermenting it into something at the moment, to ethanol at the moment? Do you know of anything?
You know, there are initiatives. If I'm not mistaken, particularly in Europe, there's small companies that are trying to increase the efficiency of that conversion. Now, maybe this doesn't have to do directly with farming per se, but I don't know if you're aware of the Sargassum Problem in the Caribbean. So these are huge masses of these particular seaweeds that arrive into the Caribbean, and they are covering the shore. And what happens is that the biomass is so thick that you cannot see sand anymore, or for several meters you cannot see water when you stand in the beach. So one of the ideas is bringing these to digesters, biodigesters, and producing methane, and try to get energy from that. I don't know how developed the idea is, to be honest.
That seems to me one of the least energy intensive ways of getting some sort of fuel out of it. And if you were to ferment it, you'd also get quite a lot of leftover biomass, which would probably make rather good compost or fertilizer. So it seemed like maybe one of the easier ways, but of course, I don't know if it's an economically viable strategy. Speaking a little bit more about the invasive seaweeds, this is supposedly a rather large problem, or it is a large problem. Typically, I believe the conventional story is these seaweeds are picked up in the bilge tanks of ships. They're brought all around the world. They're introduced to environments where they don't belong, and they can, the same way any other invasive species can, they can spread and outcompete and damage ecosystems. Could you speak a little bit more to some of the problems we're having with invasive species of seaweed and other such issues?
Yeah. So here I'm gonna take the role of an ecologist.
Please.
and and really problem, it's our definition of problem. Besides working on seaweed aquaculture, I'm very interested in a field called ecosystem engineering. And this is understanding and measuring how particular organisms modify the environment in such a way that it makes or create suitable conditions for other species to inhabit. So that's very theoretical. So many seaweeds, by definition, are excellent ecosystem engineers because once they settle, they modify their environment, and then you start seeing little critters getting close to seaweeds, or if the seaweed is larger, then you have fish, you have other animals. Think on a kelp forest, for example. If you snorkel in a kelp forest, you will see a lot of fish. If you snorkel outside, you will see none. So what happens with invasive species is that they can be great ecosystem engineering and provide services that were not there before. So is that really a problem? Not really. So I think sometimes we need to be careful of how to define what is a problem and what is not. I do recognize there are problems. And one of the problems is, for example, when an invasive species becomes dominant and replaces everything else, and it turns out that this particular species is not a good player. So instead of building habitat, it destroys habitat, and then you have less species around. And this can affect fisheries eventually. Some seaweeds are toxic, so they are not good food sources for other animals. So for now, I think that the biggest, or maybe the problem that has more recognition by the media is this Sargassum problem. This type of seaweeds are very successful at settling and also growing on flotation. And when you have this massive growth, what happens is that, remember, as every living organism, it uses oxygen. So if you have a lot of this in a limited body of water, what is going to happen is that you are going to deplete the body of water from oxygen until you have daylight and they start using CO2 and producing oxygen. But while there is no oxygen, everything dies. So including fishing, well, everything. And it becomes a dead zone. And dead zones are a thing, especially with this sargassum.
So it's interesting because while seaweed can cause dead zones, in some cases we're actually, I believe actually in Long Island Sound, we're seeing how some of this aquaculture can actually reverse dead zones, clean water and create a new habitat. So it's an interesting irony, I would say, that both it can potentially cause and solve the same problem.
Yeah, that is correct. And this is a dynamic balance that we should never forget about. Again, maybe not to bring the idea that if you put too many farms there, you're gonna cause dead zones. That is not the case. I mean, these are extreme events when you have uncontrolled growth on a limited space.
Right.
But kelp farms are something that happen only temporary. Then you remove them when it's harvest time, and then you put them again. So that is not the case. But it's true. Sometimes too much is not. It's not that good.
Just to be clear, when I refer to it can both cause and prevent dead zones, I'm specifically referring to the irony that it's both beneficial when used in aquaculture and negative in the case of the sargassum. Not to say that aquaculture could cause dead zones.
Correct.
Don't want to scare anyone off. Kelp scares enough people off as is, so. Yeah. Kelpsidia is for everybody. So let's say hypothetically you had the entire Department of Energy back whatever you wanted to invest in. What steps would you take to really change if you had basically unlimited funds, what would you do in this field to cause some positive impact. Money is no object, hypothetical.
Wow. Wow, I never had the luxury of this question before.
Yeah. No.
I think there are many good things happening right now. There is a lot of effort on trying to domesticate kelp. So one of the things is continue along that pathway. Perhaps I will take more examples from agriculture. Let me say something. Agriculture has made many mistakes in the 10,000 years of history that it has. We are, let's say, on our first decade of real kelp aquaculture, maybe 2 decades. So what we are trying to do is learn from those mistakes, not to make them while we are venturing into the ocean in farming. But there are also good examples from agriculture that we can take, and it's maybe this series of baby steps to domesticate a species. So you first start selecting, let's call it by hand, and it doesn't necessarily jump right away into hardcore genetics of kelp. So maybe I will personally take a step back and try to understand more kelp dynamics within a farm. Perhaps it's only me who is not clear about everything. Perhaps there's other researchers that are very clear on every single step that needs to be taken. I will go for that. I will bring this closer to people to understand what is the importance, why we are doing this, why the United States is investing so much money. That's another thing. Try to bring this closer to the community for sure.
That's interesting.
Besides that, go ahead.
Instead of hypothetically just putting them everywhere, you would do outreach, essentially, to get people on board. Interesting. Do you think that's really, so my hypothesis or my thoughts on the subject was that there was an economic sort of bottleneck happening. As you said, that it needs to be at a certain scale to be used for energy. But do you think that it might just be a public perception bottleneck, or just people who are not aware or adventurous enough to eat kelp?
I think it's a little bit of everything. Tradition, I think, number one, tradition. You know, over the years, I found that, well, I found many things, but sometimes I found people that is very afraid, and the word is afraid of seaweeds because of the way it feels when you walk on it on the beach. So that rejection translates into the fact that they will not taste seaweed whatsoever. So that is one thing. The other thing is that right now, if you're thinking from an entrepreneur point of view, what I'm thinking is that there is a lot of risks to be taken, because again, there are many things that we don't know about scaling up in the ocean or working in the ocean per se, which is perhaps different in the state of Alaska because they have this proximity to the ocean. So perhaps that transition will be different here than any other place in the States. But that's my thought. I'm not guaranteeing that. Yeah. But, you know, perhaps something that I would like to see, and again, I have a very utopic way of thinking, is instead of thinking that this is going to be an enterprise that is going to be taken by huge companies that can, you know, put a huge farm here and there, maybe we should replicate the effort at the community level, small fishing co-ops that gather, and that way I will think that we could spread or bring mariculture to a larger scale in the whole United States.
And
because
and employ quite a few people along the way.
Correct. Because when you have a company that mechanizes everything, then you don't need that much labor.
True. So if you were hypothetically a person who may be entering college now or is just interested in the field and wanted to progress and contribute, what advice would you give such a person at the moment?
To think very well. When we're starting,
I sort of gave
we
you
have a lot. We have a lot, like a broad
right. So
panorama.
let's say hypothetically we have someone who's beginning college next year, next fall, and
Mhm.
is interested in marine biology, maybe alternative energies, and wants to be involved with seaweed aquaculture. What advice would you give to them?
Um, I'll ask them to think, what is the end goal? Why do they want to go into this? Because again, it has so many components. It can be, the engineering aspect of it. It can be outreach. It can be economics. It can be what is the societal part of it. So first pinpoint that, and then start learning more about the system. Like let's say that someone comes in and ask, I'm very interested in the farming aspect of it. Then I will say, okay, start understanding what is the system that you are going to work in. Because working in the ocean is not like working on land. We are natural on land. We know that we walk and we move forward, but it doesn't necessarily happen in the ocean because you can go forward and down.
Right.
Or up if you float. And then, start gathering small tools here and there. This is a very multidisciplinary area in which you need so many things, including a lot of math and a lot of oceanography, understanding the ocean, and basic biology, genetics.
Right. So let's divide that earlier question up into two parts. We discussed how someone who's maybe in college could potentially get into this field, but let's say hypothetically you are a fisherman. Maybe you're in an area that is economically depressed, or where the marine ecosystem may be either threatened or has collapsed. What
Mm-hmm.
sort of avenues does someone like that have to get into aquaculture as opposed to fishing?
What do you mean as far as avenues?
So let's say hypothetically, you watch the podcast, you're in a situation where maybe fishing is looking less and less like a long-term
Mm-hmm.
strategy. Is there anything you can do as an individual to bring this sort of aquaculture to your area, or to get involved in it economically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think the US is moving in the right directions in the sense that every region it's organizing as it suits better for the region. So there are organizations that are already bringing smaller groups together and working pathways into training, into how to go through the paperwork of aquaculture, how can they join efforts to leverage resources. And then you have good examples right there in New England. Also, the state of Alaska is organizing several groups. And the idea is to move as a whole instead of an individual farmer.
Mm-hmm.
So my advice will be, first, look for orientation in those areas. Who is organizing here, and who can give me a better idea of what's the panorama. Perhaps sometimes we as scientists, we're biased by the romanticism of the science behind it, but then going into practice, especially when you have to invest, that is something different.
Taking a step back from an economic perspective,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that what is needed is more investment, or more awareness and desire to purchase kelp related products?
I think both. My feel right now will be that the immediate bottleneck is marketing,
Mm.
uh, finding out what to do with the biomass.
Mm.
because as you know, as there is a market, then there will be more opportunity to go bigger, and this will bring us to another set of questions. But right now, I'm not gonna say it's not worth it, but right now, if it's hard to move forward with the science behind it, but if nothing is gonna happen to the biomass, because then we will not be able to raise interest from potential investors, or you know, investors calling farmers and someone that can buy the biomass. So it's important to find a market.
So taking a step into the more theoretical for a moment, as most of us are aware, the climate is changing in certain different ways. One example of this is areas which were previously not acceptable for agriculture are becoming more acceptable. Some of these are actually the southern tip of Greenland, different parts of Iceland, southern Canada. When I see these communities which are already fairly isolated, beginning to actually grow crops, it appears to me that in many cases the bottleneck is just the simple fact that there's very little topsoil in these areas because they have been under glaciers for most of the past 10,000 years or longer. In my sort of like romantic daydream, it seems to me like this would be a very interesting opportunity to have something like a seaweed biodigester, which produces energy and also produces this nutrient-rich compost, which could be used to fertilize and build topsoil. Is this completely ridiculous daydreaming, or is this something that could theoretically be possible with enough economic oomph behind it?
I think it's a beautiful daydream, and I think that's the way we need to start thinking outside the box.
Yeah,
we need to find ways.
If it's going to be warm, we might as well make it fertile, you know.
That's correct. That's the thing. We cannot expect that we will be solving issues the same way we did 200 years ago, because that is not the way it's going to happen. We need to adapt. And, well, that's what evolution shows us, right?
Right.
You adapt, or you evolved.
Yeah. I'm really drawn to, I mentioned earlier that I find it sort of difficult to explain to people what I found so interesting about kelp as a crop, and we've sort of gone over many of the more logical and obvious avenues it could be used for. But I think what struck me was that it seemed like I could imagine a better future with this technology in it than I could without it, if that makes sense. Like I could imagine it, like, let's say everything else is exactly the same in both universes, but in one universe you have this crop which doesn't require any fresh water or fertilizer, and doesn't compete against other sources of food or energy, and it could be grown maybe in places around the world where conventional agriculture isn't even an option, like Greenland, for instance, or northern Greenland. It just seems to me like a puzzle piece or a brick in building a slightly better world. Maybe that's romantic or blonde, but that's what got me in the door, personally.
I think so. I mean, I think we need to start thinking on this way, you know, a little bit on the romantic and side of it, and acknowledge that these things will become real eventually. I mean, eventually we're gonna run out of land. You know, I don't know if you're aware, but right now it's not only that fresh water is limiting, is that the fuel that we have is getting saline because of water intrusion.
Right.
So we need to start moving to the ocean. The thing is, how do we do it wisely? How do we learn about the many mistakes that we have done and do it in a fairly sustainable way? And we can get good examples from Asia because everything is new for the Western world, but Asian countries have done this for years already. Of course, oceanographic conditions are different and culture is different, but at the end it's the same. We're moving into the ocean. So yeah, it's about learning how to do it respectfully with the environment and doing in a very harmonic way where we can still enjoy of the ocean for whatever we use it for, even for sightseeing.
Right. Well, on that note, Schery, it's been great to talk with you today. This has been really enlightening, and I hope it made some people at least a little bit more optimistic about the future. Is there any other organizations you would like to plug, essentially, if people want to contribute or get involved in any way? Or any, please, or any
Yeah,
different companies that are producing kelp-related products that you'd like to shout out?
sure. If you feel curious about how good kelp products can be, you can check out Atlantic Sea Farms. They are located in Maine. There's also Blue Evolution that produces pasta or seaweed pasta here in Alaska. There's Barnacle Seafood that has kelp relish, kelp salsa, spicy salsa. I've heard it's pretty good. I haven't tried that. I tried the seaweed salads. They're fantastic. And the nice things is that they are locally produced. They are produced at a very limited scale. So you can kind of think that this is a personalized product made for you. Also, if you want to get invested in understanding more about how to build a farm or set up a farm, you can get in touch with Greenwave. They are located in Long Island Sound. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, they can do so as well. They can email me, and I will try to respond as quick as possible. Yeah, Ian, it's been great. Try to again think outside what I'm usually thinking about. Of course, seaweed, but more in a more talkative way. So it's been great sharing this time with you.
Schery, I wish you all the best in Alaska. Please stay warm for all of us, and we wish you all the best. I'm sure you're going to have a great time. Again, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much for the invite.
And everybody, that's the Moot. Take care.